We just finished a really cool sermon series. I heard from a lot of people that it was enjoyable. We were talking about mental health and how Jesus intersects with things like anger and depression and anxiety and apathy. And we really honed in on what does it look like to be present with God in the midst of these struggles, and how does God want to bring us to progressive healing day by day, where we have more trust in Him, that even though we're still struggling with some of these things, we can begin to overcome them and see victory in the midst of them. And it was such a great series, but even throughout it all, there was the sharp reality that we faced that for some people, even maybe some people in this room, you are going through a season of so much turmoil, so much hurt, so much darkness, that it's hard to even see where God might be present. And it might even seem like God is absent. And so this was in the back of our mind as we were going through this series, that God can work with people and He can bring healing, but there are times in our life where it seems like we're just asking, God, where are you? Where are you? I don't see you. I don't understand what you're doing. I don't understand why this is happening. And it was perfect that series segued right into this next one that we're starting today. And this series is called Unseen Presence, Finding God in Unexpected Places. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take 6 weeks and look at Old Testament characters. These are characters whose lives embodied some of the most magnificent elements of God's presence, and yet also some of the hardest moments of what seemed like His absence. We're going to be talking about topics like crisis and betrayal, topics like loss and oppression, topics that are very relevant to our lives. And you might, in any one of these weeks, find yourselves reflecting on past seasons in your life, or maybe even current realities in your life where you feel that the darkness has overcome you, that the crisis is so in front of your face that you can't even see where God is, when the sting of betrayal hurts so badly that you don't even want to carry on. And so we're hoping that this will be an opportunity for you to see how God works in and through these time periods where it sure seems like He is not present. And so we're starting off today in the book of Esther, talking about crisis and how God is present even in the midst of crises when it looks like He's not there. Now, Esther is a huge book to tackle for one sermon. And so what we're going to do is we're going to watch a video by the Bible Project that does a masterful job at setting up the book of Esther so that it can give you a high-level orientation that will provide you with some guideposts along the way as Jeff comes up and brings the message on how this is relevant to us and how we can see Esther as a case study to learn about finding God in the unexpected places of crises in our life. So check out this video.
The book of Esther. It's one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. The main characters in this story are 2 Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing 2 elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, and it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther's going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king, he can't sleep, and he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading, and he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution, and the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all she's Jewish, and second that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim. to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Pur-im. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's two banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story: Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story's not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral examples, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we began: why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history, and he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
I am really glad that we have the opportunity to study this book together because it helps us know that God is at work even when we can't see him. And let's just be honest, when we look around at the world, a lot of the times we're just emotionally numb to the problems, but there's certain times and moments or certain things that really grab our heart and just break our hearts. I mean, there's just a lot of problems in the world, and even as Robert was talking about our friends at TCI and the invasion of Russia and war and governments and leaders, and you just see corruption, you see evil, and you just look around at culture, and a lot of the times we're just used to it, but then at certain moments you just say, wow, things are really disoriented and dysfunctional, and dysphoria is all over, and so it just can seem like our culture is really jacked up. And then you look around and you see, even if you had the best upbringing, you look at other people and you see the trauma that they've had to go through in their childhood, and how that fuels, no doubt, all kinds of victimization. You know, the abused become the abusers, and then people end up doing all kinds of things in their search for significance and happiness, and leads to all kinds of moral compromise. And all of that just factors in, and what we're seeing here is that it really wasn't any different back in the day of Esther. And so I just want to highlight some of the things about how messed up it was, dig in a little bit so that we're able to really understand our context in the conflict and crisis and brokenness that we see around us, that the same God who was at work back then is at work here even now. And my hope and prayer has been that we will find not only comfort in the midst of this, but also courage and conviction to do our part to live for such a time as this. And so first, let's just take a look here at the world that Esther was born into. The book of Esther is set in a time in human history, the Israelite history, called the exile. And so that's basically picture the United States invaded by a foreign nation, and the best and brightest of America are hauled off and put and relocated to live somewhere else. And so there, those Americans, Israelites, had no land, no king, no army, and basically there's a bunch of people who wanted them dead and sought to exterminate them. And so that's a pretty scary and disorienting place to live. And so no doubt they had this sense of, where is our God when we're living in this kind of a situation? And then we get this book, and we start reading at the beginning about this life for the Israelites. And there's this king, and he's got this drunken ruckus that goes on, and he demands that his wife come in to show off her to his drinking buddies, and she refuses, and he excommunicates her and says she's no longer the queen, and makes this really wicked edict of like, okay, in every home, the wives must do everything the husbands demand. Yikes. I mean, it is hard to read this book because of the degradation of women. And this is the context. This is what we get. And interestingly enough, even in the Hebrew, when you're reading this book in the Hebrew, the verbs are in the passive tense. And it's just all part of this literary style that's communicating this sense of hopelessness. These characters are just stuck in a machine and a mechanism that's well beyond their ability to do anything. And so it's not only a jacked up culture and a messed up world, but Esther is born into this personal tragedy. And you just look at her childhood trauma. You know, in Esther 2, it talks about how when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. It's her cousin. And we don't know how they died, but we know this, that losing both parents as a child, and some of you have experienced loss of one or both parents, it is an incredibly traumatic thing. And it sends people on an incredible search for significance in their life. And so you can only imagine the devastating effects it's had on this young girl, Esther, living in a foreign land. And then you add in this challenge that she is incredibly attractive. Now, some people might be like, how is that a challenge? I actually did a little research on this. You might think that that is not a disadvantage, but according to what those say who are incredibly beautiful, that you're often objectified or hated because of your appearance. You have to live with the burden of not knowing if people really like you for who you are or just because of what you look like. And so basically it just, what they all say is it can really mess you up. So there you got Esther, born into that. And then you get the victimization that came because of that, and the moral compromise that was complicit in this. And let me just, there are some real adult themes. I'm really going to try and keep this kid-friendly, but not wash over. This is more Game of Thrones than VeggieTales. So the king makes an edict to round up all the beautiful young virgins of the land so that they can basically have overnight auditions after a year of beauty treatments, so he can pick whatever he fancies to be his new queen, and the rest can just automatically be part of his harem. They called it concubines at the time. Now, this sounds to me like government-sanctioned sexual abuse, and yet there are no indications here that Esther or Mordecai are resistant. Basically, the text just says the king rounded up people, and Esther was one of them. So you're just left wondering. You just don't know what's going on, and this is called intentional ambiguity in terms of literary style. And so you don't know if she's being taken advantage of by the system or if she is taking advantage of and working the system, or maybe it's a little bit of both. The victimization and the search for significance. We don't know what kind of religious compromises she made, but she was breaking rules from the Torah left and right, no doubt. So basically, the bottom line is this is no love story. This is no Disney princess. Picture Amish girl on The Bachelor. The book of Esther, though, guys, it is not meant to show us how to behave in morally questionable situations. You know what the book of Esther shows us? It shows us how God behaves in the midst of the real world that we find ourselves living in, marked by culture that's corrupted, leaders that are off track, and trauma that makes people victims, and then in turn makes them complicit in making all kinds of terrible choices with their lives. And so let's look at some lessons we can pull from Esther that I think can help us Because, again, I just want to keep going back to the powerlessness that we can feel living in a world that's so broken. Obviously, a lot of the times we're just numb to it, as I said. But if you let it sink in those moments when it touches your life, you can just really feel gutted. And there's good news here, because God is at work in that world, in this world, the very one we're living in. The first lesson is this: we interpret our story in light of the story. And let me explain this. Let me unpack this. Because when we're in a crisis situation, whether it's a personal crisis that we're going through with our friends, family, loved ones, it could be health or financial or relational, just internal struggle and emotion. When we're in the midst of that crisis, or when we're in a crisis and our life's fine, but we just can't stand it. We look out at the world, we know someone, and we see what they're going through, and it's just torturing us. It's so easy to just zoom in to that crisis instead of panning out to realize that the difficulties of this life, in your life right now, are just but one chapter in a much bigger story. And in fact, you could even say that our entire lives are just one scene in one chapter of a much bigger book that's part of a much greater saga. And this is what the Bible offers us: perspective on how the God who made this world is on a mission to rescue and restore it. You see, this book of Esther that we're reading, it's not just about this pretty foreign orphan girl who, like they said, wins a beauty pageant to be able to influence the king. This is the story of God sovereignly and providentially working in human history to take a group of people, the people of Abraham, that he just randomly picked and said, I choose you, and I'm going to make you I'm going to bless you to be a blessing. And from your future will come Jesus Christ, the Messiah and the King, who's going to make this world right through his life and his death and his resurrection, bring about redemption, to turn things back, turn back time in history and bring us back to paradise as it was meant to be for all of eternity. And guess what? If the Jewish people were exterminated, if genocide worked, if the final solution that first was concocted here in Persia would have worked, we would not have Christ. And yet God saw fit that that was not the case. And so here he is sovereignly preserving the Jewish people through Mordecai and Esther. And guess what? That's not just the story for Jews to celebrate every year. This is our story, those of us who are Gentiles, who've been brought into the work of God through the Jewish people. And so, spanning continents and across centuries, God was seeing fit to make sure that his ultimate purpose would prevail. And here's the catch. What if your trivial little small life that can seem so insignificant is actually a part and a piece in this much larger story? When we begin to think that way, when we begin to read and interpret our life and the crises that we go through in light of the bigger story, it doesn't make all of our decisions easy. It doesn't take away stress or pain. It doesn't take away temptation. It doesn't make life comfortable. But you know what happens? We begin to find a comfort and a strength that helps us almost surge into the future that is actually full of life and meaning, because the immediacy of the darkness is not the end. There's light shining above those clouds, and seeing our story as part of a bigger story helps us zoom back and get beyond the immediacy of, again, the struggle and the crisis. And so your life is not just a random series of disconnected events, but it is actually part of a tapestry that God is weaving. And from the back, it may look like a tattered mess, but when that day comes, when he turns it all around, we will just stand, we will bow in complete mystery and awe at the way God worked it out. And so that's the first lesson we can draw. Just as Esther and Mordecai weren't just part of the story of their lives, they were part of the big God story, so we interpret our lives and even the very, very dark and difficult days we may find ourselves in. Number two, There's no such thing as luck or chance because of God's providence. There are so many examples of this in the Bible, but we're just going to focus on the ones given here to us in Esther. Think about how it played out. You've got the evil Haman, and he's trying to extinguish and eliminate the Jewish people from that whole place, the place where he lived. And look at this. Isn't this interesting that the Jewish person Mordecai just happened to be at the gate one day when he heard of a plot to assassinate the king, and he reported it. And the king, on the night before the edict where the Jews were going to be destroyed, just happened to have an inability to sleep. He just happened to be wakeful that night. And so he just happened to say, read me from my royal edicts. And they just happened to turn to that page that told about Mordecai reporting. And so this this fluke, this coincidence, and just the fact that Mordecai was still alive. He's still alive because of Esther, his cousin, that he helped raise. And think about this, Esther. She just happened not only to be the queen. We saw how it worked for the first queen. If the king didn't like what she did or didn't do, that was it. But she just happened to have such favor. I wonder why she had such favor. Was that just a fluke or a random coincidence? And so she was the one that God used to expose this evil plot and with Mordecai to undermine it. And then you even rewind back further. Would she have been queen if she wasn't beautiful? Even her physical appearance, was it just a random coincidence, or was it part of something much greater? And if she had not lost her parents, even something as tragic as that, would she have been in a situation where she would have been whisked away into the king's harem like this? I mean, I'm playing out the possibilities. And at a certain point you say, wait a second, this isn't just a random chance. God is at work in the midst of all of these circumstances. This is called providence. And I want to offer you a definition of providence. You know, the word providence is not in the Bible for God, but it's a theological idea that we can draw and surface from all these different teachings the Bible does give us. The providence of God is his purposeful sovereignty by which he will be completely successful in the achievement of his ultimate goal for the universe. Do you know how freeing it is to live believing this? For God's providence carries his plans into action, guides all things towards his ultimate goal, and leads to the final consummation. Now, I just want to acknowledge, this idea has stymied the minds of the brightest, God-loving, Bible-believing theologians through the centuries. Here are four basic things that are undergirding the idea of providence. Number one, we all are free in some sense to willingly make choices that have consequences. Number one. Number two, God holds us accountable for our choices. He holds us accountable for evil. Number three, God, we could say, ordains or uses all things to accomplish his glory and fulfill his purpose. Even evil, terrorists, crazy gunmen, abusers. This idea that the evil that people somehow seem to have a measure of freedom to do is actually somehow used by God for his sovereign purposes. Number four, God never does evil, and he's never to be blamed for evil. The mind begins to break down. How is it that God ordains it, but he didn't do it? And we just reach a point where we say, I don't understand exactly how it works, but this much I know. I can trust God's providence, even when I can't see it. And I can trust that he is going to work out his ultimate purpose, which is his glory. But you know what his glory is? It's our greatest good, redemption and restoration. Providence means good things aren't just random chance, and all bad things, not just some, all bad things will be redeemed. Now, there's a distortion to the doctrine of providence, And this is a fatalism that can creep in. Oh, well, if God's going to work it all out, then I'm just a cog in the machine. I'll just sit back in idleness and await the outcome. And this is the third thing we see from Esther. We have a very important role to play. I want you to listen to Mordecai's words to Esther when he pitched the idea for her to risk her life to go before the king to save the people. He says, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time," look what he says next. Isn't this interesting? He doesn't say everything's gonna fall apart. He says, no, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. That's the providence of God. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you've not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. What this means is that God is going to accomplish his purpose one way or another. Will you or won't you fulfill your part in his plan? We have a choice to make as to our yes or no to the work of God. But there is no choice about the fact that God's success will be achieved in the end. So look at Esther's response here. It's not laziness or passivity or fatalism. No way. She is quickened by this confidence that God is going to work to act even more intensely. Look what it says. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Wow. No matter how humiliating the conflict situation you may find yourself in, no matter how hopeless it might seem right now, no matter how disqualified you might feel because the way you've walked away from or buried your faith or made moral choices that completely fly in the face of what you say you believe, God is working out his sovereign plan, and he's inviting you into it. Not the people who have it all together, the people like Esther and Mordecai. So we're responsible for our actions, guys. And our actions have real consequences. And there is an action we can take that has incredible consequence. It is to pray. God is going to accomplish his success in righting the wrongs of the world, but he's chosen to work with us and use our willingness to do crazy stuff like fasting and praying for the brokenness in this world, for the kids who are being traumatized and abused, for the women who are being victimized, for the broken leaders and officials and policies around the planet that are wrecking society as God meant it to be. And yet, do we? How often do we just kind of either turn a blind eye or sit back with a fatalism that says there's nothing we can do, or, oh, well, God's going to work it out. We miss the part. We have a critical role to play. I had a conversation with a girl in a young adult ministry years ago, and she said, "I don't believe in God. I can't believe in God." Why not? She said, "Because I look at children in the world and I see their suffering and their plight. How could there be a good and powerful God in light of that situation?" And I didn't have any great words to answer her query. This is the question. It's theodicy is what it's called. The question of how can there be a good God when there's so much pain and suffering in the world? But I just said to her, is it possible that you're pointing your finger at God, but he's tapping you on the shoulder? The reason you are so passionate about this is because he is choosing to work through you. I didn't get to keep up with her, but I talked to her sister yesterday, decades ago. She went on to adopt, through a long and difficult process, 2 children who were going to get lost in the system from Haiti. And it was the faith in Christ and the support of her Christian community that empowered her to do something, to play her role. She can't eradicate all suffering of children around the face of the world. But you know what? Those 2 boys that were growing up in Haiti, she was able to do something for them. And so when we're in a situation, guys, where we're brokenhearted, when we're in a situation where our heart is pounding and it feels like I've got to take a risk and I need courage, we remember the story of Esther in those words. Maybe for such a time as this, maybe the fact that you're in the job that you're in, or you have the neighbor that you have, or those precious little eyes of your little child looking up at you, is for such a time as this. God is calling you to play your role, to bring about his restoration purposes in the world. And this is our last lesson that we can pull. Radical reversals are possible with God. He's never mentioned by name in this book. And yet we see, as he often does, he uses the weak things to shame the wise. His ways are higher than our ways. The person who looked like would have had the least possible potential to save a nation was an orphaned, young, foreign girl who's caught up in the victimization of society, complicit in some ways of her own, and yet God chose and said, that's how I'm going to display my glory. And what a reversal he did. This is the big idea. God is involved in everything, everything. God is involved in everything. What is it right now you think he's not involved in? He's involved in it. And he is using it. And he's using it for his glory. And you might not be able to see it, but guess what? He's calling you to play your role for such a time as this, to live like that. I want to have the band come up. Despite our flaws, despite all of our excuses, and even despite our tendency to live in such a narrow, self-centered, self-absorbed perspective, there is a stirring right now of the Spirit of God in your heart. And you might not even be a follower of Jesus yet, but he's working, he's drawing, and he's calling you to play your part, fulfill your role in this beautiful symphony. You might just be one instrument among a bazillion, but it's an important role. And so life is not a straight line leading from one blessing to the next and finally to heaven. Our lives, guys, are a winding and troubled road with switchback after switchback. And the point of biblical stories like Joseph and Job and Esther, as we've seen today in Ruth, is to help us feel in our bones, not just know it up here in our heads, that God is for us in all these strange turns. God is not just showing up after the trouble and cleaning it up. He is actually plotting the course providentially and managing the troubles with far-reaching purposes for our good and for the glory of Jesus Christ. You know what another way to say this is? Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good, for those who love God, to those who were called according to his purpose.